The Syrian conflict started in 2011 during the Arab Spring, a wave of protests across the region. At first, the protests were peaceful, but they soon turned violent as people demanded political reform and an end to what they saw as corrupt government officials. When the government used force to stop protests, it caused widespread unrest and eventually led to opposition groups becoming militarized. By 2012, the country was split into areas controlled by the government, opposition groups, Kurdish factions, and then extremist groups. The conflict became more complicated when regional and international actors got involved. Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia all backed the Assad government. The US, Turkey, and the Gulf states, on the other hand, backed opposition groups. The rise of groups like ISIS and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HDs, made things even more complicated, leading to years of intense conflict on many sides by 2015. Russia's military support for the Assad government was a key factor in undoing gains made by the opposition. Government forces took back a lot of land, including major cities like Aleppo. Despite these gains, the conflict severely damaged the economy and infrastructure, and millions of people were forced to leave their homes. International sanctions and problems within the country, such as economic instability and problems with government, put a lot of pressure on the Assad administration. In late 2024, opposition forces led by HTS launched a coordinated offensive that quickly advanced through government-held areas. By December, Damascus fell to rebel forces with little resistance, signaling the end of the Assad government. Some reports said that President Assad may have fled the capital and was seeking refuge at the Russian-run Cam Mim airbase. Bloomberg reports that Russia's foreign ministry said Syrian President Bashar al-Assad had stepped down and left the country. This is the first official confirmation from Moscow about Assad's whereabouts, which had been unknown since rebels took control of Damascus earlier that day. In this video, we look at the specifics of this event and Russia's position on the situation at the time of publication. Let's start by talking about the history of the relationship between Russia and Syria. It goes back to the early stages of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union tried to increase its influence in the Middle East as part of its ideological and geopolitical competition with the United States. The Soviet Union was a natural partner for Syria, which was run by socialists. From 1955 to 1958, the Soviet Union gave Syria money, military aid, and political support. Syria got about $294 million in military and economic aid from Moscow, which helped modernize its military and make its economy stronger. The alliance grew stronger when Syria opened the port of Tartus to the Soviet Union, letting Moscow build its only naval base in the Mediterranean. This base was a strategic outpost for Soviet naval forces, helping them keep a presence in the area and balance NATO's influence. During the 1970s and 1980s, Syria was one of the biggest recipients of Soviet arms, getting advanced fighter jets, missile systems, and tanks. The alliance was made official by the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation in October 1980. It included rules for military cooperation, joint economic projects, and mutual defense. Changes made after the Cold War. The breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a big turning point in the relationship. The newly formed Russian Federation took on the global obligations of the Soviet Union, but it also had to deal with big economic and political problems, which temporarily weakened its influence in the Middle East. Despite these problems, Russia kept its ties with Syria, which it saw as an important partner in the area. In the early 2000s, under Vladimir Putin's leadership, Russia started to assert itself on the world stage again. In 2000, Bashar al-Assad came to power in Syria at the same time that Putin was trying to rebuild Russia's influence. This gave the alliance a chance to grow stronger in 2005. Moscow forgiven about 73% of Syria's 13.4 billion ruble Soviet-era debt, showing that it wanted to keep good relations with Damascus. This debt relief made it possible for the two countries to work together again on military and economic issues. Syria was once again a major market for Russian weapons. It bought advanced weapons like the S-300 air defense system and T-72 tanks, which made its military stronger. What a turning point the Syrian civil war was in relations. When the Syrian civil war started in 2011, it presented the alliance with problems that had never been seen before. As the conflict grew, the Syrian government had to deal with a wider range of opposition groups, such as moderate rebels, extremist groups, and ISIS. Russia became a strong supporter of Assad's government very quickly. It justified its involvement in international forums as a defense of national sovereignty and a fight against terrorism. Moscow repeatedly vetoed UN Security Council resolutions that would have put sanctions on Syria or called for Assad to step down. In September 2015, Russia escalated its involvement by sending troops directly into Syria. Russian airstrikes went after rebel groups backed by the West and opposition forces like ISIS. During the intervention, Russian military advisors worked closely with Syrian forces on the ground. Russia launched more than 70,000 airstrikes against rebel strongholds and infrastructure. These operations were key in turning the tide of the war, allowing Syrian government forces to take back control of major cities like Aleppo in 2016 and Palmyra in 2017. There was some disagreement about Russia's military action. Humanitarian groups said that Moscow was contributing to the deaths of civilians and making the humanitarian crisis worse. Reports say that airstrikes in areas with lots of people kill civilians and damage infrastructure. The war forced over 12 million people to leave their homes, creating one of the biggest refugee crises in modern history. Russia's actions in Syria helped keep Assad's government stable and protected its strategic interests there. Goals and objectives aims for war, business, and diplomacy. Russia has been involved in Syria for a number of reasons, including economic and political ones. The Hamim airbase in Latakia and the naval facility in Tartus are important for Russia's ability to project military power in the Mediterranean and the wider Middle East. These bases also balance out NATO's presence in the area. Syria is a big market for Russian arms, and between 2007 and 2011, it brought in money for Russia's defense industry. About 10% of Russia's arms sales went to Syria. In addition, Syria is in a place that could be good for energy development. Transit routes that fit in with Moscow's bigger economic goals aspirations in the area. Russia has positioned itself diplomatically as a key player in ending the conflict in Syria. Moscow has been a major player in peace talks, such as the Astana peace talks, where it worked with Iran and Turkey to help the Syrian government and opposition groups come to an agreement. These efforts have made Russia look like a central power broker in the Middle East, competing with Western dominance in the area. Difficulties and new developments. A renewed insurgent offensive in late 2024 changed the course of the Syrian conflict dramatically, capturing Damascus and forcing President Bashar al-Assad to flee. This is a big problem for Russia because it threatens its strategic interests in Syria, including its military bases in Tartus and Latakia. When Assad left, there was a power vacuum that made people wonder who would run Syria and how Moscow would handle the changing political landscape. Making things even more difficult are the competing interests of other regional powers, like Turkey and Iran, which want to increase their influence in Syria after the conflict. Additionally, the situation has shown that Russia is not able to completely control what happens in the Middle East, as the conflict is changing and creating new uncertainties. Let's talk about the relationship between Iran and Syria. The relationship between Syria and Iran has grown over the years to include strategic alliances, shared geopolitical interests, and mutual support in regional conflicts. The two countries first met in 1946 and formed an alliance. When Iran opened a consulate, it was the start of official diplomatic relations. However, it was the Iranian Revolution of 1979 that really changed their relationship. Syria was the first Arab country to recognize Iran's new government. President al-Assad sent congratulations to Ayatollah Khomeini. This early recognition set the stage for a long-term relationship between the two countries. Getting closer during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, it was interesting that Syria was the only Arab country to back Iran, both diplomatically and militarily. This help was very important for Iran because Syria controlled important trade routes and fought against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which was an enemy of both countries. This time strengthened the alliance because both countries had similar strategic interests and regional goals. Post-war cooperation and regional changes. In the years after the Iran-Iraq War, Syria and Iran continued to strengthen their alliance. They worked together to report Hezbollah in Lebanon because they saw the group as an important part of their resistance against Israeli and Western influence. In the political, economic, and military areas, they worked together, and their policies were coordinated to deal with common threats and improve their standing in the region. The war in Syria was a turning point when the Syrian civil war started in 2011. It was a very important time in Syria. Relations with Iran became one of the main backers of President Bashar al-Assad's government, sending military advisors, money, and getting allied militias like Hezbollah to fight with Syrian forces. Iran got involved because it wanted to protect a strategic ally and keep its influence in the Levant. This intervention was key in supporting the Assad regime during crucial times of the conflict, working with it on economic and military levels outside of battle. Iran and Syria have tried to reach economic deals that will help them rebuild and strengthen their ties. Among these are agreements to trade energy and build infrastructure, with Iran investing in Syrian businesses and getting contracts to help rebuild. According to reports, Iran has a military presence in Syria. They are said to have many bases and points of contact all over the country, but mostly in Aleppo Deir and the suburbs of Damascus. This shows that Iran is determined to keep its power and help the Syrian government through its support. Russia did not help Syria fall apart. Russia's military was also heavily involved in other conflicts, most notably in Ukraine. Moscow wasn't able to send more help to Syria during the rebel offensive because of this large commitment. Russia wasn't able to effectively respond to how quickly things were changing in Syria because it was sending military equipment to Ukraine. Plans and calculations. Russian officials said they had made a strategic decision to stay out of Syria's internal conflict. Konstantin Katov, deputy chairman of Russia's upper house of parliament, said that Moscow was ready to help Syria in some situations. The Syrians themselves were responsible for a full-scale civil war. This stance shows a deliberate choice to stay out of Syria's internal conflict. Changes in the region and partnerships. The balance of power in the region changed when rebel forces, especially those linked to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, moved quickly. Turkey's support for some rebel groups made things even more complicated, which may have affected Russia's decision to stay out of the conflict. Dealing with these changes required Russia to carefully consider its regional relationships and strategic interests. Operational limits. Even though they have helped Assad's government in the past with airstrikes and military aid during the rebel offensive, Russia was limited in its ability to help right away because of operational issues. It's possible that Russia wasn't able to respond quickly enough to the offensive because of how quickly the rebels moved and how unexpected it was. Other factors, like Russia's military commitments, also played a role. Plans and calculations. Regional dynamics and operational constraints seem to explain why it didn't provide much help when Assad's government fell. At this point, we can only guess. Moscow hasn't said anything official about this development, so there may be other, less obvious reasons for its actions, or lack of actions. As of the time this video was released, the full picture is still unclear, and more events are likely to happen. May shed light on Russia's position in the coming days. That's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If our content spoke to you or inspired you, please show your support by liking it and subscribing to stay connected with our community.